This is clearly a mistake. Or worse. That's the sentence my Aunt Ronnie used the moment our family's lawyer read a name none of us recognized. Dova Reyes, written into my grandmother's will for an equal quarter share of our family orchard. It took me 6 weeks, a shoebox of 40-year-old letters, and one very quiet phone call to prove exactly how wrong my aunt was. But this really starts at a will reading that was supposed to take 40 minutes. For 8 years, reading other families' legal messes had been my actual job. Probate files, power of attorney accountings, wills contested by people who really ought to have known better. I never once expected to need those particular skills on my own family's paperwork. My name is Sloan Whitcomb. I'm 33. My Aunt Ronnie looked at the name Dova Reyes, printed in my grandmother's will, the exact way you'd look at a stain on a tablecloth you were already planning to throw out anyway. I didn't argue with her in that room. I didn't say one single word. I just wrote the name down. What Ronnie didn't know was that I'd spent 8 years learning precisely which drawer a family keeps its inconvenient paperwork in, and 4 years quietly watching her manage my grandmother's accounts a little too carefully for a woman with nothing at all to hide. 6 weeks later, a woman I had never met would hand me a shoebox that changed everything I thought I understood about my grandmother. And by the time a mediation room emptied out months after that, it wouldn't be Dova Reyes who left without a name in this family. It would very nearly be my aunt. Nobody in my family ever thought the quiet paralegal who filed things for strangers all day would be the one who finally read her own family's file start to finish. Welcome back to Quiet Reckoning, where the patient ones finally get to tell the whole story, start to finish. If you like your justice slow, thorough, and paper-trailed, settle in. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe. Let me back up. Whitcomb Orchard sits on 31 acres outside a small Vermont town. Apple trees my grandparents planted in rows in 1974, a squat red cidery building added on in the 90s, and a farmhouse porch with a swing my grandfather built the same summer my father was born. My grandmother, Opal, ran the place alone for the 11 years since my grandfather Harold passed, sharp as ever at 84, doing her own books at the kitchen table until the morning 3 months ago when she simply didn't wake up. Opal had 2 children, my father, Gordon, gentle and easily steamrolled his whole life, and my Aunt Ronnie, 4 years older, the one who always handled things, insurance claims, doctor's appointments, eventually, for the last 4 years of Opal's life, full financial and healthcare power of attorney. Nobody questioned that arrangement while Opal was alive. Ronnie was good at handling things. That was never in dispute. What was at stake, the afternoon that will was read, was the orchard itself. 31 acres that could be forced into a messy sale if 3 unequal heirs couldn't agree on how to divide it. And something else, something none of us had words for yet, the truth about who my grandmother had actually been, underneath the version of her our family had always agreed to believe. For 22 years, without exception, my grandmother called me every single Sunday at 4 o'clock. Not my father, not Ronnie's kids. Me. It started when I was 11, the summer my parents' marriage was going through something quiet and bad that nobody explained to me directly, and Opal decided, unilaterally, that I needed 1 hour a week that belonged only to me. She always ended the same way, no matter what we'd talked about, no matter how short or long the call had run. "There's always room at my table for one more," she'd say, which never quite made grammatical sense as a goodbye, and which I never once thought to question, because it was simply what Grandma said, the way some people say, "take care," or "love you." I was the quiet one in my family, the one who didn't demand much, the one Ronnie used to describe, not unkindly exactly, as so easy, she practically raises herself. I understand now that being easy and being unseen aren't always different things. Opal was the only person in my life who called every single week to make sure I knew the difference. I remember, at 14, winning a regional essay competition and mentioning it, once, at a family dinner, quietly, the way I mentioned most things. Ronnie talked over it within a sentence and a half to describe, at length, how she'd handled a scheduling conflict at Opal's dentist that week, and the table's attention went where it always went. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was just gravity. Ronnie took up the room the way certain people always will, and I let her, the way I let most things. Opal called that Sunday and asked me to read her the entire essay out loud over the phone, twice, and told me, when I finished, that she'd always thought the quietest person in a family was usually the one paying the closest attention to everyone else, and that this was a kind of intelligence nobody in our family gave proper credit to. I didn't understand, at 14, that she was describing herself as much as she was describing me. Ronnie, meanwhile, positioned herself, always, as the one who handled things for the family. Proud of it, in the specific way people are proud of a job nobody else particularly wanted. When Opal's POA paperwork was drawn up 4 years ago, nobody discussed it as a family decision. Ronnie simply announced, at Thanksgiving, that she'd already gotten it sorted, and my father, gentle and conflict-averse his entire life, said only, "Well, that's a relief. Thank you, Ronnie," the way he said most things Ronnie decided for him. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a kindness, Ronnie taking that weight off my father's shoulders. It would be 4 years before I understood. That weight and control are not always the same thing wearing different names. The reading took place in Mr. Aldous Cray's office 3 weeks after the funeral. 5 of us around a conference table, too large for the room. My father, Ronnie, her husband Desmond, myself, and Mr. Cray, who had drawn up Opal's will himself, and clearly knew exactly what was coming before any of us did. He read through the standard bequests first, the farmhouse and its contents to Gordon, a modest cash sum, to each of Ronnie's 2 grown children, the cidery equipment itemized down to the last barrel, before arriving at the section dividing the orchard's 31 acres. To my son Gordon, 1/4 share. To my daughter Veronica, 1/4 share. He paused, in the particular way lawyers pause when they know a room is about to change temperature. To Dova Reyes, 1/4 share, and the final 1/4 share to be held in trust for the continued operation of the orchard itself, administered jointly. Silence, for about 4 seconds. Then Ronnie, "I'm sorry, who?" Mr. Cray checked his own copy, unnecessarily. Dova Reyes. Your mother named her specifically, by full legal name, with her own hand, in a codicil, signed 18 months ago. This is clearly a mistake, Ronnie said, already reaching for her phone. Or worse. Mom was 84. Was anyone consulted about her competency when this codicil was signed? She looked at Mr. Cray, as if daring him to say otherwise. He did not take the dare. He simply confirmed, flatly, that Opal had been evaluated as fully competent at the time of signing, per his own office's standard practice. Ronnie didn't seem to hear that part. She was already talking over him, already saying she'd look into this properly, and that the family shouldn't do anything hasty until she had. My father asked, quietly, whether the codicil could simply be a mistake, a clerical error, a name intended for something else entirely. Mr. Cray shook his head. "I sat with your mother myself when she signed it," he said. "She was entirely clear about who Dova Reyes was and why she wanted her included. She told me, in fact, that she expected this exact reaction from at least one person in this room, and that I should say, if asked, that she'd thought about it for a long time and hadn't changed her mind once." Desmond, who rarely speaks in family matters, cleared his throat. "Maybe we table the whole conversation until cooler heads," he said, which was, I would learn, Desmond's entire function in this family. Never the one applying pressure directly, always the one suggesting the room slow down exactly when slowing down benefited his wife most. I wrote the name down on the legal pad I keep in my bag out of habit. Dova Reyes. I had never heard it before in my life. I would think about very little else for the next 6 weeks. A week later, at a family dinner my father had quietly organized, hoping, I think, for some kind of normalcy, he brought it up gently, the way he brings everything up. Maybe we should just call this Dova person. See what she has to say for herself before we decide anything. Dad's too fragile for this, Gordon. Don't, Ronnie said, not to my father directly, but about him, the way you'd discuss a patient in front of them. I've already got Desmond's cousin looking into a settlement offer. We buy her out. She signs a waiver. It's over, before it gets messy and expensive for everyone. I just think we owe her a phone call before we owe her a lawyer, my father tried again, quieter this time. You don't owe a stranger anything, Gordon, and neither do I, Ronnie said, standing to clear plates that weren't finished yet, a habit of hers I'd noticed my whole life, ending conversations physically when she'd already ended them verbally. Mom's gone. Somebody has to think clearly right now, and I would really rather it be me than have this drag through court for the next 2 years while some woman's lawyer picks apart everything Mom worked for. Nobody said anything about court, I offered, the first thing I'd said all evening. Ronnie looked at me the way you look at a chair that's spoken. No, she agreed. Not yet. And then she carried the plates to the sink, and the conversation was over, the way conversations at that table had always ended once Ronnie decided they should. I watched my father, 61 years old, 3 months into grieving his mother, get steamrolled at his own kitchen table over a decision about his own mother's estate, and I said nothing. Not yet. I told myself I was gathering information. Some of that was true. Some of it, if I'm honest, was simply that I hadn't yet decided whether this was mine to get involved in at all. That same week, trying to be helpful, trying to make things easier the way I always try to make things easier, I gave Ronnie my own login to the shared family document folder, where we'd started collecting Opal's estate paperwork, so she wouldn't have to keep asking me to forward things. It would take me a month to understand exactly what that small convenience had let her quietly do. Within 2 weeks, Desmond's cousin, a lawyer in the next county over, not our family's lawyer, not anyone with an actual duty to Dova Reyes, had drafted a settlement agreement offering a modest cash buyout in exchange for a full waiver of any claim to the orchard. Ronnie tried to get my father to co-sign it on behalf of the family, framing my questions, when I finally started asking them, as making an already hard situation harder than it needed to be. You didn't even know this woman existed 3 weeks ago, Ronnie told me, not unkindly, more tired than angry. None of us did. I'm just trying to protect what's actually ours before some stranger's lawyer gets involved and drags this out for a year. I want to be fair to my aunt here because fairness matters to me, professionally and otherwise. Nothing she'd said out loud, at that point, was provably false. It would take me 2 more weeks to learn that the person most protected by moving fast wasn't the family. It was her. News like this doesn't stay contained to one kitchen table for long, even in a family as private as ours. My cousin Belinda, Ronnie's daughter, one of the 2 grown children named for the modest cash bequests, called me directly within the week, which she almost never does. Mom says some woman's trying to take half the orchard, she said, tight and worried. Is that true? It's a quarter share, and Grandma named her herself, in her own handwriting, while fully competent, I said. That's what's true so far. Everything else is still being figured out. There was a pause I recognized, the particular sound of someone recalculating what they'd already been told. That's not really what Mom's been saying, Belinda admitted quietly. I didn't push it further that day, but it stayed with me, the realization that Ronnie wasn't only managing the estate, She was managing the story, one phone call at a time, to whichever relative she reached first, and doing it well enough that by the time I called anyone myself, I was already correcting a version of events that had gotten there before me. My grandmother used to say that a story left alone always gets told by whoever's loudest first. I was beginning to understand exactly what she meant by that, and how much of my own family history had probably already been shaped by it. I do this for a living. I read probate files, POA accountings, court filings, all day, for people who are not my family, and I am good at it precisely because I don't let anyone's framing tell me what I'm looking at before I've looked. So instead of trusting Ronnie's summary of handling things, I requested the actual probate court filing, public record, something I'm entitled to access professionally, and something any family member is entitled to request regardless, rather than relying on the version Ronnie had been giving my father over the phone. What I found was 4 years of POA financial accounting, with a pattern I recognize instantly in other people's files and had somehow never thought to look for in my own family's. Unusually round number miscellaneous disbursements, logged without receipts, without itemization, clustered suspiciously around holidays, and, twice, suspiciously close to dates when Ronnie's own household had made large purchases I happened to know about from family conversation. None of it, on its own, proved anything criminal. POAs manage money imperfectly all the time, out of genuine care, genuine exhaustion, genuine good faith. But it was exactly the kind of pattern that, in a stranger's file, would make me request a formal accounting review without a second thought. I sat with the printed pages spread across my own kitchen table for most of a Saturday, the same posture I use at work, highlighter in hand, a legal pad for cross-references. Except this time, every name on the page was someone who'd held me as a baby. I flagged 11 disbursements over 4 years, totaling just under $31,000. None itemized beyond the word miscellaneous, or, twice, family expenses. In any other file on my desk, I'd have already drafted the request for a formal accounting. On this one, I sat there for a long time first, highlighter uncapped, before I let myself actually do it. I found Owen Farrell in his office on a Friday evening, the one semi-retired probate attorney at my firm who'd mentored me since my very first year out of school. Still at his desk, the way he always was long after everyone else had gone home. I laid out what I'd found and what I was tempted to do next, and asked him, plainly, what I was and wasn't allowed to do here as a private family member rather than in my professional capacity. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which is rarer in this business than people assume. You can look at anything that's public record, he said finally. That includes probate filings, and you have every right as an heir yourself to request them. You can ask your father questions as his daughter, any questions you like. What you cannot do is use firm resources, firm time, or your professional standing to build an investigative case against your own aunt like she's a stranger's opposing party. The second you do that, you've turned a family matter into something a good lawyer on the other side could argue was improperly obtained, and everything you found becomes a lot less useful in a room that actually matters. So, what do I do with what I already have? You hand the pattern to a mediator or a court, and you let people whose actual job this is decide what it means, he said. Your job in this story isn't prosecutor, it's witness. There's a difference, and it's the difference that'll keep you sleeping at night 5 years from now, whatever happens to your aunt. It was good advice, and I mostly followed it, though mostly is doing a fair amount of work in that sentence, because staying only a witness gets harder every single week. You watch someone you love get lied to by someone else you love. Stay with me. The letters are coming, and once you hear what's in them, you'll understand exactly why my aunt didn't want anyone else reading this file. Subscribe so you don't miss it. 3 weeks after the will reading, Opal's longtime next-door neighbor, a sharp, unhurried 80-year-old named Mrs. Halloway called and asked me to come by when I had a minute, no rush. She'd known my grandmother 50 years. She handed me a shoebox, faded and soft at the corners, and said, "Your grandmother gave me this to keep safe about 10 years back. Told me if anything ever happened to her, and anyone in the family ever needed proof of anything, I was to hand it to whichever one of you asked the right questions. You're the first one who has." Inside were 4 decades of letters. My grandmother, it turned out, had formed a quiet, unconventional, decades-long bond with a young single mother named Elena Reyes, who'd worked one summer at the Orchards farm stand back in the early 90s, then moved away, and stayed close to Opal by letter and by phone for the rest of her life. Opal had helped her through a health crisis that first summer, quietly, without ever telling our family. Elena had passed away herself, 11 years ago. Dova was her daughter. One letter, dated 8 years back, in my grandmother's own unmistakable handwriting, was almost unbearably direct. "If anything ever happens to me, Dova is family, full stop, and she gets her share, whatever anyone else in this family thinks about it. I've told Ronnie as much. I expect her to do the right thing when the time comes, though I've learned not to bet the farm on it, so to speak." And, near the bottom of the box, a single envelope, opened once and clumsily resealed with a different piece of tape than the rest, addressed to Elena in Opal's hand, with a note in Mrs. Halloway's own writing clipped to it. This one came back. Opal always wondered why Elena never answered it. I think, now, somebody else opened it first. I sat on Mrs. Halloway's front porch for close to 2 hours reading through that box, and she sat with me the whole time, refilling my iced tea without being asked, occasionally offering context I hadn't known to ask for. "Your grandmother used to drive out to see Elena twice a year. When Elena's health first started going bad, she told me, told your grandfather it was a quilting retreat. I don't think he ever once questioned it, bless him. Opal wasn't hiding something shameful, understand? She was just a private woman who'd learned, a long time before any of us knew her, that this family had a habit of deciding for people what they were and weren't allowed to care about." Did Ronnie know all of this? All of it? Mrs. Halloway considered the question carefully, the way she considers most things. "I couldn't say what Ronnie knew and when," she said. "I can tell you Opal mentioned, once, a year or 2 back, that she suspected a letter had gone missing somewhere along the way, and that it upset her more than she let on. She never said Ronnie's name out loud to me. I don't think she needed to, and I don't think she wanted it to be true badly enough to look any closer." My aunt had known about Dova Reyes for years. My aunt had, at some point, intercepted a letter my grandmother never knew went missing. I found Dova Reyes through a public records search that took me less than an hour, a skill that, again, I use professionally every week and had simply never turned toward my own family before. She taught middle school 2 states away, and when I called, she was guarded, understandably so, clearly braced for exactly the kind of family drama and money conversation she'd apparently already had with Desmond's cousin's settlement letter sitting unopened on her counter. "I don't want any part of this," she told me, flatly, within the first minute. "I don't need money from people who think I'm a scam." I almost let her hang up. Then, without entirely planning to, I mentioned the Sunday calls. That my grandmother had called me every week for 22 years, always signing off the same strange way. Dova went quiet on the other end of the line for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "She called me every Sunday too," she said finally, her voice different now, unguarded in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds earlier. 6 o'clock, not 4. For 12 years, she always ended it the exact same way. "There's always room at my table for one more." I thought that was just something she said to me. Neither of us said anything for a moment after that. My grandmother had loved us both, fully, separately, every single week, for over a decade, and neither of us had ever known the other call was happening at all. "Can I ask you something?" Dova said, once we'd both recovered a little. "Why are you the one calling me? Not your father, not your aunt, you." I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Because I think I'm the only one in this family who wanted to know the truth more than I wanted to be comfortable," I said. Everyone else decided what the answer was before they asked the question. She laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Your grandmother used to say something almost exactly like that to me. That most people go looking for the answer they can live with, instead of the one that's actually true, and that it takes a specific kind of stubborn not to." A pause. I liked her stubborn. I didn't expect to like anyone else in this family the same way, if I'm honest. "You don't have to decide that yet," I told her. "I'm not calling to get anything from you. I just didn't want you to be the only person in this whole thing who never got a phone call that wasn't about money." We talked for another 40 minutes after that, about nothing in particular. Her students, the drive from her town to ours, a dog she'd almost adopted twice, and talked herself out of both times. It was the first conversation in 6 weeks that had nothing to do with accountings, disbursements, or settlement offers, and it was, strangely, the one that convinced me most clearly that whatever happened with the orchard, I wasn't going to let this be the last time we spoke. I didn't decide what to do next on my own. My grandmother was gone, and the person whose agency actually mattered here now was my father, not me. So I drove out to see him and laid out everything I'd found, the accounting pattern, the letters, the resealed envelope, and let him sit with it before I said one word about what I thought should happen. He was quiet a long time, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table, the same gesture I'd later realize I'd inherited from him entirely. "She kept this from me for years," he said finally, meaning Ronnie, not Opal, her own brother. "And she let me think a stranger was trying to con our mother when she knew this whole time exactly who Dova was and exactly why Mom wanted her included." "What do you want to do, Dad?" "I want it done properly," he said. "Not shouted about at a dinner table where it just turns into a story people take sides on for the next 20 years. I want a mediator, a record, and every single piece of paper in front of people whose job it is to actually look at it." It was, almost word for word, the instinct I'd been circling myself. We requested formal mediation the following week. Before I tell you about the mediation, I want to tell you about the Saturday before it, because it's the reason none of what came next ever curdled into something uglier than it needed to be. My father asked if I'd come out to the orchard with him, no particular reason given, and we spent the better part of an afternoon doing nothing more useful than walking the rows Opal and my grandfather had planted the year my father was born, checking branches out of habit neither of us had any real expertise to justify. He told me, apropos of nothing, about the summer he was 19 and wanted to sell the whole place and move to the city, and how Opal had simply handed him a rake and said, "Fine, but the trees still need thinning this week regardless of your plans," and how, by the end of that week, he'd changed his mind entirely, though he was never sure if it was the orchard that changed it or simply the exhaustion. "I keep thinking about how much of her I never actually knew," he said, sitting down heavily on the old porch swing, the wood still holding the shape of 40 years of people sitting exactly there. 40 years of letters, Sloan, a whole friendship, a woman she helped through something hard enough to write about for decades, and I had no idea any of it was happening, my whole life, 3 miles from where I grew up. "Would it have changed anything, if you had known?" I asked him. He thought about it a long time, the swing creaking softly under him. "No," he said finally. "I don't think it would have changed one thing about how much I loved her. I just wish I'd gotten to know her as a whole person, instead of only as my mother. That's the part I'm grieving now, more than the money, more than any of it. Not losing her, realizing how much of her I never got to meet." It was the calmest either of us had felt in 3 months. I held on to that afternoon hard, In the tense weeks that followed, the way you hold on to the one clear photograph from a trip where everything else came out blurry. 10 days before the mediation date, sensing something in the family had shifted, Ronnie tried one more move. She caught me after work, casual, warm, the way she gets right before she asks for something. Since you're at the office anyway, could you just notarize something for me? Confirming the family's proposed valuation is fair, professionally, as a favor, it'd carry more weight coming from you. This isn't something I'm able to notarize for family, I told her. A complete sentence, no debate offered alongside it. She recalibrated instantly, sweetly. I just thought it'd be easier, coming from you. I watched her file my refusal away as an inconvenience, not as the warning it actually was. Exactly the way I now understood she'd been filing away inconvenient things for years. If you've ever found out the person managing your family's money wasn't quite telling you the truth, you already know exactly where this is headed. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's go to that mediation room. The mediation was held in a plain, wood-paneled conference room at the County Courthouse Annex. Court-appointed mediator, Ms. Ada Ora Bello, at the head of the table, both families' attorneys present, my father and I on one side, Ronnie and Desmond on the other. What Ronnie did not know, because I had specifically not told her, was that Dova Reyes was going to walk into that room in person for the first time in this entire story. I'd invited her myself, the week before, gently, leaving the choice fully hers. I don't want the exit, she told me on the phone the night before. I think I want the table. I just don't know yet if I'm allowed to want that. She'd driven up the night before and stayed at a motel off the interstate rather than accept my offer of a guest room, which I understood completely. There's a limit to how much unearned family intimacy anyone should be expected to accept in a single month. She wore a plain gray blazer, sat with her hands folded on the table, exactly the way I imagined she must sit with parents at school conferences, and didn't look at Ronnie or Desmond once as she took her seat, though she looked, briefly, at my father and at me, and nodded, small and steady. When Dova walked in, quiet and visibly nervous, and took the seat Ms. Bello indicated, I watched my aunt's composure slip for the first time in 6 weeks. She had assumed, I think, hoped, that a woman offered a check by mail would simply take it and never surface in person at all. Desmond actually turned in his chair to look at the door behind her, as if expecting someone else, a lawyer, a witness, anyone who would explain why the plan had changed. Nobody was behind her. She had come alone, which somehow made the room take her more seriously, not less. Ronnie's attorney opened by framing Dova's claim as unverified, opportunistic, a name added late in an elderly woman's final year. Under circumstances the family has real concerns about. Ronnie nodded along at every phrase, arms crossed, the same posture I'd watched her hold at the will reading 6 weeks earlier, as though nothing at all in the room had changed since that day. Desmond sat beside her saying nothing, the way Desmond always says nothing, which I had started to understand was its own kind of participation. Ms. Bello, unhurried, asked the attorney to clarify what specific concerns he meant, and he faltered slightly, reaching for competency language that Mr. Cray's own office had already confirmed didn't apply. I felt my father go very still beside me, the particular stillness of a man watching his sister's case start to wobble on its own weight before anyone else had lifted a finger against it. I asked Ms. Bello's permission to enter something into the record. Not as a paralegal, I was careful to say, just as Opal Whitcomb's granddaughter. I laid out the letters. I laid out the resealed envelope. And then I asked my aunt one quiet question, the only one that actually mattered. Ronnie, when did you first get a letter back from Elena that you never passed on to Mom? Silence, the specific kind that fills a small room faster than a large one. Ronnie's attorney tried to redirect. Ronnie herself said nothing at all for several seconds, which said more than any answer could have. Then Dova spoke, unprompted, quietly, not defensively, just simply true. She used to call me every Sunday, 6 o'clock, for 12 years. She always ended the call the same way. There's always room at my table for one more. She looked directly at Ronnie for the first time since sitting down. I didn't come here for a check. I came here because I finally found out I wasn't the only one she said that to. Ronnie's voice, when it finally came out too loud for the room, aimed first at her own attorney, then, worse, directly at her brother. You have no idea what it was like managing everything for 4 years, while you just showed up for Sunday dinners, Gordon, so don't you dare sit there and judge how I handled one complicated letter. My father didn't raise his voice back. He didn't need to. He simply said, level and quiet, I'm not judging how you handled the money, Ronnie. Ms. Bello can look at that. I'm asking why you let me believe our mother's own choice was a stranger's scam when you'd known who she was for 30 years. Ms. Bello, unhurried, noted for the record that the accounting irregularities would require a formal independent review regardless of how the inheritance question itself resolved. Ronnie did not shout again after that. She simply sat very still, which read, in that small room, exactly like what it was. Here's the fallout, laid out plainly and completely. Ronnie was removed as executor within a month. A neutral court-appointed administrator now oversees the estate's remaining business, and Ronnie is formally repaying the disputed disbursements on a schedule set by the court, without criminal charges being pursued. The quiet option, same as it so often is in families that would rather heal privately than punish publicly. Belinda, my cousin, called me again about 2 weeks after the mediation, quieter than the first time. I owe you an apology, she said. I believed the version I was told because it was easier than asking my own mother a hard question. I told her she didn't owe me anything. I understood, better than most people could, exactly how much easier the easy version always is. Ronnie's relationship with my father is distant now, careful, occasionally civil at a holiday table, nothing close to reconciled, and I've stopped expecting it to resolve into something tidier than that. She still, as far as I know, believes she was only ever protecting the family from an outsider, and I don't think that belief is going anywhere soon. Some doors stay half open for years. That's not failure. That's just honesty about how long some things actually take. Dova was offered, at one point during the settlement talks, a larger cash payout in place of her actual property share. A cleaner, simpler exit, everyone agreed, less complicated for the family. She turned it down. I don't want the exit, she told the room, echoing what she'd told me on the phone the night before. I want the table. She and I talk every Sunday now, 6 o'clock, a tradition neither of us had any right to expect, and both of us, it turns out, badly needed. My father joined some weeks too, awkwardly at first, better lately. The first time the three of us were all in the same room together, a month after the mediation, was for no occasion at all, just dinner, at my father's house, Dova driving the 2 hours without much conversation planned beyond, let's just see how it feels. It felt, for the first hour, exactly as careful and overly polite as you'd expect 3 near strangers, bound by one dead woman's love, to feel. Then my father brought out an old photo album, and Dova pointed to a photograph of the farm stand from the early 90s and said quietly, I worked that register. I was 19. She used to sneak me the bruised apples for free and pretend she hadn't noticed. My father laughed, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from him in months, and said, she did that to every kid who ever worked here. Told us all it was our secret. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Nobody cried and hugged and called it healed. But it was a real table with real food on it, and nobody at it was performing anything for anyone else's benefit anymore. The orchard stayed whole, Gordon, Dova, and I run it together now, informally. None of us quitting our actual jobs for it. All of us showing up on weekends, the way Opal always somehow managed to make look effortless. Last month's harvest was the first with all three of us in the rows at once. My grandmother used to say something I only fully understood after that mediation room emptied out. Some people protect a family, and some people only ever protect the story they tell about it. Ronnie spent 30 years protecting a story. Opal, it turns out, had been quietly building a bigger table the whole time, one nobody else even knew was under construction. That's my story. One shoebox, one resealed envelope, and a Sunday phone call that turned out to have been happening twice, in 2 different houses, for 12 years, without either of us ever knowing the other was on the line. If somebody in your family is quietly deciding who gets to belong before you've even heard the whole story, take this as your sign to go read the file yourself. You might find out your family's table was always bigger than anyone told you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.